Today, as we've seen, is Remembrance Sunday, and I struggled with a title for this sermon, but in the end came down with Peacemakers. Last year, as we marked Remembrance Sunday, who would have imagined that we'd be seeing a major war in Europe right now? Yet Russia has invaded Ukraine, and hundreds of people a day, military and civilian, are being killed even as we gather here today. And if you're like me, it leaves you wondering, how do we end the conflict? What is the end state? How do we sort the problem out? In 1990, when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, the minister of the church where we were then worshipping was adamant that war was the wrong response to resolve that situation, and said it to me. And my challenge to him was, well, how do we get justice for those who have been invaded without reason? It's an important question, and one which, given events in Ukraine and the various threats being made by the Russians at different times, we do need to think about. But it shouldn't just apply to a conflict that's in our backyard or that may suck us into the destruction. As Christians, how do we react to conflicts, and what does right in those circumstances look like? This morning, with our act of remembrance for those who have died or were injured in wars fresh in our minds, I want to look at some of the biblical principles that apply. But I'm going to say right up front, I don't believe there is one simple answer to the issue. Each war, each conflict is different. But even when, like Ukraine today and Kuwait in 1990, they are clearly the victims of unwarranted aggression, no country can claim to be perfect in their dealings with their neighbours and their citizens all the time, which raises complications for us. But to start, we need to recognise that war and conflict, along with other disasters and crises, are going to be part of our experience until Jesus comes again. Jesus said this in Matthew 24, 6-8. He said, "You will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See, you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginnings of the birth pangs." But it's also clear the Bible does not condemn the profession of arms, just its abuse. During his ministry, Jesus healed the centurion's servant in Matthew 8, 5-13. And he commended the man for his faith in verse 10. But truly, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found as much faith as in this Roman soldier. And when soldiers went to John the Baptist and asked what they should do when they repented in Luke 3:14, he said, "Don't extort money from anyone by threats or false accusations. Be satisfied with your wages." And one of the most significant converts to Christianity was the centurion Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. It was his conversion and baptism in the Holy Spirit that made the early church recognize the gospel was available to the Gentiles as well as the Jews. But in not one of these instances is there any suggestion that being a soldier or a sailor or an airman is incompatible with having faith in God. Now, historically, we can see it was very rare for Christians to be soldiers during the first 2 centuries of the church's existence. But that was mainly because of idolatrous practices. As a soldier, you were expected to swear allegiance to the emperor, which was done through worship of his idol. There were various other ceremonies throughout the year for your unit and various other places where, again, you were expected to take part in worship of idols. And for the Christians, they couldn't do that. Now, We need to recognize there are many Christians today who are pacifists. And there may be some sitting here today. They would argue that pacifism is an application of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. After all, in Matthew 5:39, Jesus said, "Do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one also." He told us to love our enemies in verse 44 of that chapter. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And they would also point out that Jesus lived by these principles and demonstrated them during his arrest, his trial, and his crucifixion. I would argue that we would follow his example. Now, I have to say, I admire the many sincere pacifists in various conflicts, but especially during the last wars, the world wars, that even when under pressure from society, the threat of jail, and various other things, stuck to their principles and refused to fight. But there were many who, despite not wanting to carry arms, took on dangerous roles as stretcher bearers and frontline medics. Or they took critical roles in civil defense. So they played a part, they put their lives on the line, but they refused to strike back. I was looking for an example, and I did find this guy. This is Corporal Desmond Dross from the US Army. He was a pacifist, yet he won the Medal of Honor. Because in a battle in the Pacific, he saved between 50 and 100 men. People lost count. I think he did by the sounds of it. Despite being wounded 4 times, including by shrapnel when he tried to kick a grenade away from the men he was protecting. But he refused to carry a weapon. He was a pacifist. And he served despite the fact that when he got called up, he was actually in a reserved occupation in a shipyard and didn't have to go at all. That man has my admiration. But not all Christians would agree with pacifism as a stand. And many, and I know there are a number in the congregation this morning, including myself, were and are happy to serve in the forces. So what's the biblical position? Well, our duty as Christians is to reflect God's kingdom and to play our part in its extension in the world. We're to be imitators of Christ, who gave the perfect example of the principles of God's kingdom. In imitating Jesus, we're called to be a community that is hungry for righteousness, that pursues peace, that doesn't take revenge, and that loves our enemy. And we look forward to the final coming of that kingdom when everything will be remade perfect. And when, as Isaiah put it in Isaiah 2:4, they will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But until that day when Jesus comes again, and armies, navies, and air forces become redundant, we should be working for peace and righteousness. And that should be something that every Christian, pacifist or otherwise, can agree on. The question is always, how? Our goal should be peace with justice. And this can't be achieved by simply appeasing those who would threaten us or others. We've seen the impact of that. We tried to appease Hitler. You can have a bit of Czechoslovakia. No, I'll have the whole thing, and I'll have Poland, and I'll have. And look what it cost to sort that out. Peace with justice comes with a cost. A few weeks ago, we looked at how God restored us into a relationship with him, how he created peace with us and gave us righteousness. But achieving that meant Jesus going to the cross and bearing our sin there. And however we work for a just peace, the peace that is what Jesus exemplified, whether as a pacifist or someone prepared to support or even get involved in a conflict, it will come at a cost. And we need to be ready to pay that cost. The passage we read earlier in Romans 13 teaches about the role of the state as God's agent. And from the first verse, where it says, "Let every person be subject," its main focus is on what or tends to be, we think its main focus is on law and order. Not preventing wrongdoing, finding and punishing those who break the law. But we'd failed to recognize that in those days there was far less separation between what we would think of as law enforcement and justice and the military. Roman soldiers often were the police. They were detached from their legions and are sent to a place as what was called a stationarii, where they acted as the local police force. But also we've got to think, it's one thing when an individual breaks the law, or a small group, like a gang breaking into the bank. But what happens when the wrongdoer is not an individual, but he's another state? Well, verse 4 tells us that the state is God's servant for our good. It is as much the state's responsibility to protect us from hostile action from another nation as it is to protect us from criminals who want to steal our goods or beat us up. But we also need to look at the context of the passage. The previous chapter, the end of the previous chapter, Romans 12, 9-21, is talking about love. It includes instructing us to bless those who persecute us in verse 14. It tells us not to take revenge in verse 17 and verse 19. And it tells us to live peaceably with everyone as far as it's down to us in verse 18. And if you read on in chapter 13, verses 8 to 10 is also about showing practical love to those around us. So how do we reconcile these adjacent passages? Well, the difference is that the surrounding sections are addressed to us as private citizens and as individual followers of Jesus. We should be reflecting all of those characteristics described. But the first part of chapter 13 is about our government, our responsibility to them, and their duties to us. And these are different to ours as individuals. What does that mean? Well, we're all used to taking on different roles and responsibilities in our lives, depending on the context. Yeah, here we go. So, think about it. We're all children. We've all had parents. And if our parents are still alive, we have a duty of respect and love to them. We may also be parents. And as our duty to our children includes disciplining them so they grow up in the right way. As employees, we may have staff that work for us. And our responsibilities to them are different to the responsibilities we have at the same time to our managers. So we have all these different responsibilities, and the same thing applies here. What we have, our duty as an individual Christian is one thing, our duty to the state and the role of the state is a bit different. But one thing is clear, as Christians, we should be tempering how we fulfill these responsibilities with love, mercy, and justice. And that can be a difficult balancing act. Even more so if we work in the police or the armed forces, and especially in times of conflict. Our duty to be subject to the governing authorities also, Romans 13, does not depend on how they rule. It would be nice if it did. If it was a democratic government, not a problem. But if it's a tyrant or a dictator, no. But when Paul wrote those words, the emperor was Nero. He was an absolute ruler, and through his 14-year reign became increasingly oppressive, and including towards the end of his life in AD 64, actually launching a major persecution after the Christians after the Great Fire in Rome. Indeed, tradition has it that both Peter and Paul died in that persecution. But there are limits on what a state can legitimately do. The execution of justice and punishment of wrongdoing by the state is on behalf of God. It should therefore be in accordance with God's law. It should be tempered with mercy. It should be limited to those particular and individual people who have done wrong. The use of force should be limited to the minimum necessary to bring them to justice, and the punishment given should be in proportion to the evil they've done. And there are limits also that we as Christians must abide by, which is where the instructions of the authorities conflict with our duty of obedience to God. Acts 5:27-29 records how the apostles took this stand against the Jewish authorities. They brought them to stand before the high council, and the high priest questioned them and said, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you're determined to bring this man's blood on us." And Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than any human authority." Now, the same principles apply both to the state and ourselves when we're facing a situation where the wrongdoer, in the case in point, is another state. Now, there are some practical differences, especially as there is very limited outside authority that a state can call on in case of aggression against it. We've seen over the last few months how hamstrung the United Nations has been because of its structure and the fact that Russia is on the Security Council. But there are rules of armed conflict. There are treaties that restrict the use of particular types of weapon. And there are the Geneva Conventions, even if some of these can realistically only be applied if the offender loses the war. Over the centuries, the church has developed a concept of just war. Now, this isn't something which you'll find laid out as a clear statement in the Bible, but it's been based by scholars over the years considering the teaching of the Bible and seeking to apply the principles that we've just looked at. John Stott, in his book Issues Facing Christians Today, summarizes the conditions for the just war down to 3 statements. Okay, first of all, the cause must be righteous. The objectives of a war must be to secure justice, to remedy injustice, to protect the innocent, or champion human rights. Now, hopefully, it's immediately obvious that a war can be just for one side, but not for the other. I would say, for example, the war in Ukraine falls squarely within these criteria for the Ukrainians, who are resisting unwarranted aggression, but not for the Russians. War should only be a last resort, only after attempts at negotiation and diplomacy have been exhausted. So if you think back, again, for those of you who can remember that far back to the Gulf Wars, then there was a lot of discussion and argument about whether negotiation had reached its climax or they could still carry on. And of course, it should follow a formal declaration by a legitimate authority. An individual or a group can't decide they're going to wage a war. It's got to be a nation state. And then perhaps the critical one, the intentions must be as righteous as the cause. There was, for example, suspicion in some quarters that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was driven as much by a desire to gain control of all the resources as to deal with the threat of weapons of mass destruction. If that was true, it would have made that invasion unjust under these terms. Although many people would argue even without that motivation, it was unjust on other grounds. Second statement, the means used in war must be controlled. The use of force must be both proportionate and discriminate. To be proportionate, it mustn't be a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The violence that is applied must be such that the ultimate gains outweigh the losses that will result. This can, of course, be difficult to assess or measure, especially in advance, and even more so if you're trying to balance material damage against, say, loss of human freedom. But I'll also say it's not a one-off decision. A war can start off with proportionate force, but then people will do things that are beyond that. And one example would be the destruction of Hamburg and Dresden in the Second World War. Now, a lot of people, particularly today, feel that was excessive. But even at the time, there was at least one bishop who stood up in the House of Lords and protested about it and told the government to their face they were wrong to let that go ahead. And discriminate. It means that the war is directed against enemy combatants and military targets, and that civilians should be immune. Now, with the development of modern weaponry, air forces, long-range missiles and so forth, it's becoming more difficult to achieve this in some ways. A country's infrastructure, the factories that produce essential war goods, the things that support their armed forces, can be targeted now, whereas in the past they couldn't. But while targeting a factory making missile components, and coincidentally killing the skilled workers that are in there at the time, may be a legitimate act, bombing residential areas of a town to kill the workers just by flattening the area is clearly not. And we've seen too many cases in wars where, either by indiscriminate bombing or deliberate targeting, civilians have become the victim rather than the combatants. And then finally, for the just war, its outcome must be predictable. Well, as predictable as it can be. There must be a calculated prospect of victory, and therefore achieving the just cause for which the war was begun. In other words, going to war when you know you will lose is both foolhardy and likely to sacrifice the life of thousands of people for no prospect of achieving the cause for which they died. Now, some people would argue that there are occasions, even when faced with a more powerful enemy, or where the circumstances such as distance, logistics, and weather favour the enemy, that a country may still go to war on a matter of significant principle. Some people have said that Britain going to war against Germany in 1939 to fulfill our treaty relationship with Poland was exactly such a case. The Germans were obviously a powerful army. We didn't have the force to fight them, but we went to war. The Falklands in 1982. The US and the Russian military both thought we had no hope of retaking the islands. But the principle there was the islanders were British, they wanted to stay British, and we went and fought to return them to that status. And most recently, of course, the determination of the Ukrainians to defend their independence and their way of life against what everyone believed was the overwhelming power of the Russian army. Just another example. So in that case, it seems, to quote someone, when they started, the Russian army was considered to be the second most powerful in the world. Now it's apparent it's the second most powerful in Ukraine. Probably third if you count all the tanks the farmers have got. But what these cases do is show that the prospect of victory may be much harder to calculate than a lot of so-called experts, expert analysts and pundits would like to care to admit. But where does this leave us? Well, as I said at the beginning, there are no simple, easy answers to some of the challenges that war and conflict raises for us as Christians. However, one thing is certain, we are called to be peacemakers. In his description of God's people, we call the Beatitudes, Jesus included peacemaking, Matthew 5, verse 9. And it's probably worth noting there's a whole list of characteristics. They're not optional extras. You can't select any two out of the seven or whatever. It's all of them apply, including the peacemaking. And Romans 12:18 is about more than refusing to inflame a quarrel when it talks about living at peace with people. Paul is saying that we need to be positive peacemakers, at least as far as it lies with us. If the other party doesn't want peace, or demands conditions for reconciliation that would require unacceptable moral compromise, then we can't accept those. That doesn't mean that we then start, we still try to live peacefully with them, even if they don't live peacefully with us. We need to learn to treat the call to be peacemakers seriously and put it above our own convenience and desire. Like I said, it's not an optional extra. We mustn't assume that we can't do anything. We may be just a single voice. But any great change there has been in the world so often starts with that single voice. A single person who's prepared to take a stand for what is right. And then you find there's a lot more. Think about Elijah. When he complained to God, he said, I've worked for you, I've been your prophet, and look at it, I'm the only one left. And what did God say? No, there's 7,000 more who haven't done it. They're there, you just don't know about them. Sometimes being that single voice, standing up to be counted, means other people will come and rally round. We can all use all the available channels to make our views known to our MPs and to the government. And when the government is doing something wrong, particularly, again, thinking about war and conflict, we should. And it's even better if we don't leave it until the concern has become a crisis. And if we're walking closely with God, if we're open to his leading, obeying him, then our single voice is the one with God on our side. So who can stand against us? But our most powerful weapon before, during, and after a conflict is prayer. And we should use it fully. We're called to pray for our national leader, 1 Timothy 2:2. And Jesus specifically told us to pray for our enemies. We should also pray for wisdom to know what is right in what are always complex situations. Prayer should be our first response to our concerns about a possible conflict and our ongoing resort during one. Our God is the one who placed the governments of the world in place. Romans 13:1 tells us that. And their authority comes from him and him alone. He's the one who has used the rulers of the nations that didn't know him to achieve his will. He used the Assyrians and the Babylonians to punish Israel and Judah for rebelling against him. He used the Persians to bring his people back to their land at the time he had promised. And it's also noticeable that if you read the prophecies around that, there are so many prophecies which condemn and threaten punishment on the nations who laughed at Israel, got carried away and committed atrocities against Israel beyond the punishment that God had intended. What God has done before, he can do again, and he will ensure his will is carried out. And he's the God who answers his people's prayer. In Matthew 5:13, Jesus said, we're the salt of the earth. Not the way our current English idiom uses, good chaps, but salt of the earth, a seasoning, a preservative. Our saltiness in the world should prevent things going off. But to do that, we need to be applied. We can't be sitting in the salt cellar on a shelf. We need to be out among the world to be about our Lord's business. And that includes some people, it's not for everyone, but some people at least being in the military. In that circumstance, to act as a restraint on our human tendency to excess, and particularly excess when it comes to violence. This Remembrance Day, in human terms, we face a more uncertain future than any I can remember since the end of the Cold War. But we can be confident in God. He is in charge, and we are securely in his hands. No one can snatch us from him. We can stand up. We must stand up against the worst the world can do, confident that even if they kill us in response, we are in God's hands. In Matthew 10:28-31, Jesus said, "Don't fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground unperceived by your Father. Even the hairs of your head are all counted." And that's a difficult job on some of us because I know I'm losing mine, but never mind. So don't be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. As Jesus' disciples, we are God's ambassadors in the world. We need to make clear his kingdom's values, to stand up for right and speak up for peace and justice, to be his peacemakers. And if we don't, who will?